Good morning, everybody. And I understand you're still getting situated and arriving, so please make yourself comfortable. So we're going to start today. Are we on a? Nope, we're not on a full screen. Let me get from. There we go. We are going to talk about human rights and justice today. And justice being how this system of the government, for the most part, that type of justice, is set up to interact with human rights and secure human rights. But we're also going to talk about how non-governmental organizations support those processes and work outside government too. So that's the goal today, human rights and justice. So there's variation in justice for human rights. How and why does justice for human rights vary within and across regions? What have you noticed? Just across India or across Mizoram, what has been any difference in how justice has happened, particularly justice for human rights? Is there anything you can think of that you would like to share? Any observations? Maybe we should pick an identity group and see if it varies for them. Do you have, let's see, how about, different ethnic groups of different ethnic identities, ethnicities, labels as to who they are. So, for instance, here we have a lot of the Mizo peoples, and other parts of India we have different groups of identities. So, have you seen any variation across India in the justice for Mizo peoples versus another group of peoples? No response. So that must be a good observation that you haven't noticed any difference. Or maybe I'm making an assumption here and that we'll come across some examples later. Anyway, in many parts of the world, there is variation in how justice is provided for people in the same region, let alone between regions. So we want to look at what are the factors that cause this variation in justice provided to human rights. So justice is influenced by ethics. And we started out this program talking about how ethics underlies everything in human rights. And that's something that all regions of the world have agreed upon, and that is ethics and human rights are highly related. Maybe not the same system of ethics, morality, and values, but that ethics underlies all conceptions of human rights. So the ethical beliefs of a region's dominant population influence the justice decisions its system makes. So the dominant population, when we say dominant population, we mean the population that may not be the greatest in number, the largest group of people, but we mean the people who are most represented in that region. Maybe they're more represented in politics. They're more represented quite often in the curriculum in the schools. They're more represented by economic affluence. They're more represented, not always, but quite often, by spirituality and the religion of the area that dominates, the most represented religion, but not always. So the justice system quite often reflects who's the dominant population of a region. And the plurality of ethical beliefs around the world contribute to the variable support of human rights in courts. So because we have all these different beliefs in what constitutes ethics, as it's often played out in different types of spirituality and religions, that affects also how justice is provided or not, especially in the courts. And I should say on that, because the courts often represent the laws that are created in an area, and the laws that are put into code and then enforced in an area reflect the dominant population usually, and the one that can have the loudest voice. Even if you have a democracy and a representative government, they're usually heard the most and the most represented. And around the world right now, in many countries, including India, there are struggles and increased polarities between groups for that dominance. And some of that is aligned with religion, but not all of it. Justice is influenced by identities. And so identity characteristics affect the treatment of people whose rights are impeded or denied. So dominance is not necessarily an identity. It just means that's the group that has the most power. But we've talked about identities earlier in this program, and we'll talk more about it again when we get to teaching in human rights. But identities influence whose rights are impeded and undenied in legal representation in the courts. Justice is influenced by politics. As discriminatory actions and policies expand with political approval or disregard, courts can be less successful in litigating rights. So what comes in favor of the leading political mindset, if you will, influences how these rights are interpreted in the courts. And judges may be wary of upholding rights when repressive or discriminatory laws enjoyed wide support and are championed by politicians. So if the politicians, the leading politicians of an area, particularly a nation, country, are promoting through their discourse, usually what they're saying, but also their actions and who they interact with publicly, they're promoting discriminatory laws or discriminatory actions. Judges in the courts are more reluctant to provide rights, as they should be, as they're in the codes. They're protective of themselves and their jobs. And so this is information that was provided by the Open Global Rights organization that's been collecting data and analyzing data, and they've noticed these patterns. This doesn't mean everywhere, but this is what has been found through research as sources of variations in justice and human rights. Domestic courts are the first step for addressing local human rights violations. So domestic courts within the country, within the locality, your courts here are the first place you would go to take a case of human rights violation. You would go to those courts. But when those courts don't do what you need to, again, maybe because of the factors I just mentioned and others, international criminal courts will look at the case. You can go beyond your state and nation and take it to another body. Now, most of the time, international criminal courts are looking at violations between nations, arguments between nations about who should do what and who harmed who and whose populations are being violated by the other. And the International Court of Justice settles, according to international law, legal disputes between the states. Transitional justice. Give me a thumbs up if you've heard this before, because I don't know how much legal and law background you have. Have you heard of transitional justice? Okay, I don't see any thumbs up. So transitional justice after HR human rights violations, they're just what it sounds like, to transition. It's not necessarily transform when we talked about models of conflict resolution and conflict transformation. They should be. That's another step. But to transition out of violence, especially horrific violence. So areas where they've had genocide and ongoing horrific violence, it doesn't have to be widespread, but it's been ongoing. after the violence stops, then transition can happen. Some specialists who work in this area can come in and work with the populations to help them move on from the violence. This is really, really important also in education with children, because their parents may have trouble moving on and continually talk about, that group of people and those people who harmed us, and you can't, be friends with them in school and so forth. They learn this from their parents, and I've worked in areas where this has been passed on for many, many generations. The violence happened a long time ago, but that identity group we can't be friends with because of that. Well, transitional justice tries to facilitate healing and cooperation, working together. So the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, that are relatively independent organizations established in states, gather information about and record widespread violations of human rights. So coming in with the truth about what happened and reporting it and recording it helps clarify, okay, this is what happened. It's not this story versus that story. That's one step in transitional justice. You've heard, I'm sure, about transitional justice happening in the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions in South Africa, and how Nelson Mandela, who then was elected president, approved that and promoted that to help populations there heal, and listen to the stories, listen to the violators who hurt each other, admit it in courts, commissions and courtrooms, and just admit it and then accept forgiveness by those who were harmed and to try to move on. And this is a really critical step in bringing about transformation in a society. So that's transitional justice. Transitional justice can include specific foci for under-aided populations. The International Center for Transitional Justice has a gender justice program because Truth Commission mandates, judicial opinions, and policy proposals for reparations and reform are usually written, interpreted, and implemented with little regard for the distinct and complex nature of gender-based violations. So reparations are measures to try to repair the harm. In areas where I've observed, reparations have been quite often monetary, to give a group of people or even a person something to rebuild their lives, to start over again. And it's very hard to get approval for reparations, one, because maybe the government doesn't have any money to give out to do those repairs, and they can't get it from other organizations. And but what this organization has noticed is that the repair processes are less for women, and they leave the steps for women as underdone or not done at all. And so they've formed their own program, gender justice program. Let's see if I can get any of these links to work here. We worked on this. No. Go back. Let me set this down for a second. Go. So now I can get it to move up so you can see it. Yeah, the gender justice program. This woman's passing out symbolic flowers to the military who are supervising everything in an area of direct violence. So I'm going to just read a little bit to you. What is the philosophy behind the gender justice program? And this is an interview with somebody in it. The creation of the gender justice program came with the recognition that men and women experience conflict and state repression very differently. Men often have greater access to political and economic resources that women do not, resulting in women being vulnerable to specific forms of violence. And unfortunately, these inequalities were often replicated in the design of many early transitional justice measures, which tended to be gender blind. These measures did not recognize that women disproportionately experience certain serious violations, such as sexual and reproductive violence, and they also often weren't recognizing that women experience the same violations as men, such as rape, killing, torture, detainment, albeit in lesser numbers. Nor did the field look at the unique ways women are affected by their husbands being killed or detained, or why the impact of internal displacement may affect women and make them more vulnerable to certain types of abuse. So anyway, that's just an intro to what they're doing. And just here, the term gender justice is about equal access to civil, political, economic, and social rights. So, and then they go on to talk about who they work with. Let's see if I can get back. There we go. Okay, and let me see if I can show you this one. The International Justice Resource Center. Oh. And there's a way to make this bigger, I think. I don't see. Anyway, this shows you the Women's Human Rights Center key women's right issues that they list here. I don't know if you can you see it that far? No, okay. So violence against women, sexual and reproductive rights, it's pretty much what I listed. The one that wasn't in the paragraph above is human trafficking. That's one I'm even more personally familiar with. Labor and employment, I've brought up before in this program how women are underpaid around the world compared to male salaries and paychecks. What women can own is property. There are areas of the world where women have not been able to own property, only their husbands or men in their family could. So that keeps them tied to the men, even if there's abuse, because otherwise they can't own anything and take care of their families. And then women human rights defenders are much more vulnerable. So they look at all these issues and they address them, and here they list the many treaties and agreements about the protection, and some of these I've mentioned to you before, the foundation of their work to protect women. And this one especially, the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, known as CEDAW, is very importantly done and addressed now around the world. Okay, I'm going to close that out. So let's move on here. So higher education addresses human rights violations. That's one reason I'm here. You're in a higher education institute or university organization, and the issues need to be addressed while you're in here this learning experience. So issues that have been addressed, and I don't need to list them all because we already know what many of the human rights issues are. Here are a couple of examples of your next door neighbor and BRAC University in Bangladesh. So in this example, they held a conference on digital dangers and human rights. And this is a growing topic as humans are losing more and more control of what happens digitally, especially through the internet, but other forms of digital interaction too. And so they had a conference about this and looked at what are the dangers and what do we have in human rights law that can help us address these dangers before things get worse. And then in this one, they addressed genocidal acts in Myanmar. So this is the university looking at, and here they have a Center for Peace and Justice, and they held a public meeting to investigate what's going on in Myanmar, brought in their research, talked about what steps can be taken, what the United Nations and what treaties should be facilitated, and how this needs constant attention. So they had a whole conference about that. Okay. So education of public employees for human rights. Some of this goes on in the universities. And a lot of it can go on outside the universities in the organizations that train or employ the employees. So I read one study by Wall, Policing Values and Violence, Human Rights Education with Law Enforcers in India. And just as a recap of their research methodology, since we talked about research yesterday, I thought would be interesting to you. They did 60 in-depth, semi-structured interviews of enforcement officers who were enrolled voluntarily, and they voluntarily participated in a master's degree in human rights. So law enforcement officers who wanted to get their master's degree in human rights. This is a highly motivated group, right? The quote from the article's abstract states, "The human rights course on which this study focuses explicitly connects human rights to Indian traditions. The officers participating in the course accept the idea that human rights embody the same values as their religious and cultural traditions. This does not, however, lead them to accept human rights. Instead, officers feel that they must compromise or reject both human rights and their traditional values in favor of competing values and interests related to their work as law enforcers." So, she interviewed their teachers, she interviewed the students in the class, all who were in law enforcement over a couple years, collected lots and lots of data, and basically came to this conclusion in this article. She talks a lot about it. I'm going to segue out of this for a minute, if I can. Let's see. Uh-oh. I don't know where the file went, where the PDFs went. I'm sorry. I had a couple PDFs open, but I'm not seeing them here anymore. So we'll, okay, maybe I'll get them open on the break. All right, so let's get back to where we were. So crisis response, UN documentation, United Nations documentation and recommendations. Which factors may be impeding resolution and transformation of a crisis? Well, as you can imagine, transformation of a crisis is really, really hard to do, right? People are in crisis. They're psychologically not normal because it's a crisis. So usually the focus is on resolution with transformation later. But those who work in peace and conflict resolution professionally realize that both are important, and quite often from the very beginning when they're looking for solutions to these problems, they're thinking of both. They're not thinking of just how do you put out this fire in the crisis. They're looking for deep solutions that will address both populations and not just a resolution. The United Nations Human Rights Council special rapporteurs urge relief to victims and investigation of direct violence in Manipur. Let's click on this and see what they're... This is the United Nations website here. India, UN experts alarmed by continuing abuses in Manipur. So the United Nations has recognized the problem and written in September this year about how the state and the country needs to address the problem. UN experts today raised alarm about reports of serious human rights violations and abuses in northeast state of Manipur in India, including alleged acts of sexual violence, extrajudicial killings, home destruction, forced displacement, torture, and ill treatment. The experts pointed to an inadequate humanitarian response in the wake of the grave humanitarian situation in Manipur. following the latest round of community conflict between the predominantly Hindu Meitei, I hope I'm saying this right, forgive me if I'm not, and the predominantly Christian Kuki ethnic communities that erupted in May 2023. And they go on to talk about how much violence has happened there, and they state that they are appalled by this violence, the United Nations reporters, and that women particularly have been attacked. And the experts said recent events in Manipur were another tragic milestone in the steadily deteriorating situation for religious and ethnic minorities in India. So the United Nations is closely watching what's going on, not just in India, but right near you in Manipur. We have serious concerns about the apparent slow and inadequate response by the Indian government, including law enforcement, to stem physical and sexual violence and hate speech in Manipur. The experts welcome the fact-finding mission conducted by lawyers and human rights defenders in Manipur, and the follow-up by the Supreme Court of India on the situation in Manipur, though the response could have come in a more timely manner. They urge the Supreme Court to continue monitoring the response of the government and other actors with the focus on justice, accountability, and reparations. Remember what I explained, reparations, helping the victims rebuild their lives. We're also concerned about reported criminalization and harassment of human rights defenders, documenting the cases, they said. They urge the government to step up relief efforts to those affected and to take robust and timely action to investigate acts of violence and hold perpetrators to account, including public officials who may have aided and abetted the incitement of racial and religious hatred and violence. Okay, bad news. But good news that the United Nations is collecting data on this. It's reporting the data internationally, and it's asking India at that time in September to do more. Okay, that's that. These are some of the references of the information that I brought, and I don't know what time it is. I'm going to hit escape here and see if I can see. It's 11:17. What time is your snack or lunch break? I only found out yesterday you had one. Can anybody inform me of that? She's not here, the one who plans it? Okay, so I don't know. Okay, so I'm going to stop right now and ask you to follow up with what I gave you to do yesterday. Planning how to facilitate the 3Ds with a civil society organization. You want me to put that prompt back up again? Because we weren't able to finish yesterday. So I would like to have you get back to that and to share in a few minutes before we take our break. So I think we can turn the camera off because I'm going to be working with individuals here to see what they were